This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
I got this, the idea for this paper back in the spring, at the time of the UKIP gains in the local elections, and it called to mind a half-forgotten memory from my youth, which was the shock and alarm produced internationally by the unexpected success of the Poujadist candidates in the French elections in 1956. Now, obviously, UKIP is a very different phenomenon in a very different world, and the title was something of a provocation. I'm not suggesting there are any simple analogies that can be read off. But the thought of looking at the Poujadist experience cut across another more long-term concern of mine, which is the history of the French left, with particular reference to republicanism, nationalism and internationalism. So I thought it might be interesting to see how the various currents of the French left reacted to the Poujadist breakthrough. Now, since it's all a long time ago, I'll spell out the key events to begin with. By the time of his death in 2003, Pierre Poujade was a forgotten man. After de Gaulle came to power in 1958, neither he nor his organisation played any significant role. In 1981, he supported François Mitterrand for the presidency. If his name's mentioned today, other than in specialist academic journals, it's because his organisation helped to launch the young Jean-Marie Le Pen. Yet his movement has left its name in the dictionaries. The Shorter Oxford English Dictionary defines Poujadism both as the philosophy of Pierre Poujade and more generally as any organised protection of the interests of small business. Poujade was born in 1920 and in the 1930s was a supporter of Jacques Doriot, who had been a communist, left the Communist Party to form an alternative party of the left, moved very rapidly to the right, ended up recruiting French soldiers to fight on the Russian front. When France was occupied in 1940, Poujade initially supported Pétain's Vichy government. But in 1942, when the Germans occupied the southern half of France, he went to Algeria to join the Free French and later served with the RAF. It's not clear what led to this change in his sympathies and whether it was more than a desire to be on the winning side, but it makes it difficult to attribute a consistent right-wing pedigree to him. After the war, Poujade and his wife became owners of a newsagent's shop in Saint-Céré in southwest France. He was therefore a petit bourgeois in the strict sense of the term, and not in the way the term is widely used in Marxist discourse, where it seems to mean, I disagree with you and will probably expel you shortly. The class to which he belonged, that of small shopkeepers, artisans, owners of small businesses, was a very powerful force in 1950s France, where a large proportion of the population still lived in small villages. 1954, France had nearly 1,300,000 commercial establishments, half of which did not have a single waged employee. And it was a social group which had some very strong grievances, especially in southern France, where the benefits of the post-war boom were trickling down very slowly, if at all. A particular grievance was the taxation system, which the small traders believed with some justice weighed much more heavily on small businesses than on larger companies. In 1953, Poujade helped to organise a local action to disrupt the tax inspection of a small trader in Saint-Céré. This had remarkably rapid resonance. Within months, Poujade was able to launch the UDCA, the Union for the Defence of Tradespeople and Artisans, with himself as the undisputed leader. By 1954, the UDCA was making a national impact and held a rally at the Veldiv, one of the big stadiums in Paris used for political rallies, attended by 15,000 people. It's necessary to say a little bit about the overall political situation in France. France was now well into what are often called the Trente Glorieuses, the 30 years of the long post-war boom. But prosperity was still very unevenly distributed. Modernisation of the economy was not running smoothly. Moreover, France had been more or less permanently at war since 1939. Shortly after the liberation from German occupation, a war for national independence began in Indochina, which lasted 8 years till the catastrophic defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. But that defeat almost immediately sparked off an armed revolt in Algeria. And although the government didn't recognise that this had actually been a war until 1999, it was having a huge impact because, unlike Indochina, it was being fought by conscripts and reservists. And these were also the years of the Cold War. France had a large communist party which could get around 5 million votes and controlled the largest trade union federation, but which was isolated by all other political currents. Negotiations were underway to establish a common market, and the struggle between defenders of secular education and church schools was still very much alive. Now, opinion polling was still pretty new, but the IFOP, the French Institute of Public Opinion, conducted a number of polls that give us some insight into attitudes at the time. During the election campaign in '55, IFOP asked voters what was the most important issue to be dealt with by the incoming government. 25% said North Africa, 15% wages and cost of living, 9% East-West relations, and only 4% taxation, which was Poujade's central campaigning point. France's problems were compounded by its parliamentary system. The Fourth Republic Constitution incorporated proportional representation, which, together with the complexities of the French social structure, produced a system of several political parties, none of which was able to win a majority on its own. So any government had to cobble up a coalition of several parties. This was inherently unstable, as governments fell rapidly as soon as a key issue divided it. Between 46 and 58, the Fourth Republic had 23 prime ministers. Only 2 lasted more than a year, and some lasted less than a few weeks. In late 1955, the Prime Minister, Edgar Faure, called an election. He called it rather early, which was a matter of some controversy. French electoral system was complex. It was based on proportional representation using a list system for each département. This was further complicated by something called apparentement, which best translates as political alliances. I won't try and explain it in full, but basically it meant that different party lists could declare themselves as being in alliance with each other. This entailed no commitment to a common programme or to future cooperation. But if lists in alliance had over 50% of the vote in a constituency, they took all the seats between them. There was very clear political purpose here, obviously, to strengthen the parties of the centre against the extremists, that is, the surviving supporters of Vichy on the one hand and the communists on the other. No other party would make an alliance with the communists. A system that was so mathematically complicated that few voters and not all candidates understood it merely aggravated the problems of French democracy. It's in this context that Poujade made his sudden turn to politics. It's apparently only at the time of the dissolution that he decided he was going to present candidates in the forthcoming elections. Up to that point, he'd always insisted that his movement was unpolitical, solely an organisation defending the economic interests of small business people. But he now rapidly turned his organisation into a very effective political machine. And in particular started to appeal to other groups, in particular workers and peasants, saying we shall all achieve salvation together or we shall all die together. Seems to have been a powerful orator as well as a formidable organiser, but in order to demonstrate that this was not about personal ambition, he didn't himself stand as a candidate. And in order to ensure that those who did stand as candidates didn't capitulate to personal ambition or get their snouts in the trough, Poujade insisted throughout the campaign that those elected under his banner would be kept under strict discipline. Le Monde reported from one of his rallies. The representatives of the people will have to obey blindly the orders issued by the National Council of the Movement. The day one of them betrays, repeats Poujade, and he insists this is to be taken literally, he will be hanged. In general, Poujade's rhetoric was very different from what you normally hear in election meetings. He told his supporters, our ancestors cut off the head of a king of France who had done much less harm than those who are ruling us at present. The central demand of his campaign was to be the convening of the Estates General. This was quite a clever demand, though its implementation would have been problematic. How exactly the representatives of the second estate, the nobility, were going to be chosen is not at all clear. But of course every French person had learned in school the convening of the Estates General in 1789 had led to the French Revolution. But as Poujade also pointed out, the Estates General was an institution which for 600 years had met when things were going badly in France. So his slogan held an appeal to both Republicans and traditional Conservatives. He told a Swiss journalist that those elected on behalf of his movement would have the sole task of paralysing the National Assembly by a systematic boycott until the Estates General have been convened. Then they will resign and will be hanged if they don't respect their commitments. He's very keen on hanging. I think this is, partly, he said somewhere that the guillotine was too expensive. And, I think it's very much the idea, well, a rope, you can get that from your local village hardware store. The elections took place on the 2nd of January. The results astounded everybody. There were 544 seats contested. Elections weren't held in Algeria because of the continuing violence. And the Poujadists took 51. You get slightly different figures in different sources precisely because of the incredible complexity of the electoral system. 11% of the electorate had voted for the Poujadists. When this was added to 145 seats, 25% of the vote for the Communists, this represented a very large proportion of the vote to so-called extremists. The Poujadists had upset the apple cart for a number of the parties of the centre, cutting their vote, depriving them of the possibility of benefiting from apparentement. In particular, their rise was accompanied by a sharp setback for the Social Republicans, which had been the Gaullist party, although de Gaulle himself had withdrawn from political life for the time being and apparently didn't even vote in 1956. The Gaullists had also represented a force that was critical of the institutions of the Fourth Republic, and some people talked about a continuity between the Gaullist vote and the Poujadist vote, although that does seem to be questionable. The Poujadists also showed that they could win a substantial number of votes beyond their base in southern France, where the conditions for small tradespeople were worse. Opinion polling, as I've said, was more primitive in those days, and the Poujadist success seems to have been largely unexpected. There was a major surge in the few days before polling. 2 weeks before polling, the distinguished political analyst of Le Monde, Jacques Fauvet, predicted about 10 seats for Poujade. And a few days later, Poujade himself, trying to talk up the results, only said between 30 and 50. Poujadism now became a 9 days wonder. The popular picture magazine, Paris Match, devoted features to the life of Poujade and his wife in all 4 January issues. And there was a certain degree of shock all around the world. From Washington, United Press reported the impressive success of the Poujade movement, who was only expected to get about 10 seats, has been a complete and unpleasant surprise for official circles in Washington, who think a popular front may be established within a few months. There is a prevailing impression that Poujade, by winning the support of the non-communist malcontents, has contributed to the success of the Moscow party and prevented the formation of the centre-right majority which was expected, and consequently has deprived France of any hope of a stable government. London, the New Statesman, was equally alarmed. A record poll reveals that 2 in every 5 Frenchmen voted against the parliamentary system. In the new assembly, democracy is poised on a razor's edge. On the left stands a large block of 150 communist deputies pledged to the totalitarian state. On the right are 50 of Monsieur Poujade's street corner ruffians, with no policy except the assembly's destruction. The Poujadists' 2.5 million votes are there as a permanent warning that 5 more years of broken promises and political stagnation can fling the door open to fascism. Now, the campaign revealed a number of aspects of the policy and strategy of the Poujade movement. Firstly, it claimed repeatedly and vociferously to be apolitical and insisted it was neither of the left nor of the right. Secondly, it was in no way a democratic movement. Poujade, whose threats to hang people I've already mentioned, laid down the political line. One of his deputies, Léger, a dairyman from Le Havre, stated, "Politics isn't for me, politics is Pierrot's job. I'll do what he tells me to do." Thirdly, the Poujadist movement was unashamedly violent. During the election campaign, it disrupted and broke up meetings of its political opponents. In particular, the meetings of François Mitterrand were systematically targeted. Much of the violence was organised by a Paris law student and relatively new ally of Poujade's, the young Jean-Marie Le Pen, who drove Mendès France off the stage at the Mutualité and prevented Mitterrand holding a meeting. Le Pen was a new recruit for Poujade, but he'd had a organisation in Paris for some time with a long record of attacking communist and Trotskyist meetings with gangs of cudgel-wielding thugs. Poujade and Le Pen had allied together, and Le Pen got his first parliamentary seat, but there were differences between them. Poujade tended to remain within the Republican tradition, while Le Pen tended to use the rhetoric of the nation, and Le Pen put much more stress on defence of France's colonial empire and on militarism. Le Pen used a more violent rhetoric in his election speeches. "We shouldn't greet the retiring deputies by pelting them with tomatoes. We should greet them with Thompson guns." At another meeting he declared, "It is necessary and normal that a certain number of people should pay with their flesh for the massacre and ruin of the country." Anti-Semitism was widespread among the Poujadists. It was common to attack politicians as Jewish when they were not. Poujade claimed that the real name of Jacques Soustelle, a Gaullist of French Protestant origin, was actually Ben Sousa. A particular target was Pierre Mendès France, a former Prime Minister who'd signed the Geneva Agreements that ended the Indochina War. As Christine Ross notes, Mendès France, the anti-Poujade figure of his age and a Jew, figured prominently in the Poujadist imaginary. Poujade was fond of stating that our fathers who went to the bistros were at Verdun and Mendès wasn't there. Another more succinct Poujadist slogan was "Mendès back to Jerusalem." Mendès France was in fact descended from a Portuguese Jewish family that had lived in France since the 16th century. Poujade's main grievance against Mendès France seems to have been his attempt to promote measures against alcoholism. To Poujade, this seemed like a direct attack on his café-owning supporters. Addressing Mendès France, he stated, "If you had a drop of Gallic blood in your veins, you would never have dared, you, the representative of our France, a world producer of wines and champagne, to have yourself served with a glass of milk at an international reception. That day, Monsieur Mendès, every Frenchman got a slap in the face." Poujade always denied being a racist, using the "some of my best friends" argument and citing that there was a Jewish militant in the UDCA. Poujadist movement tended to defend the preservation of the French colonial empire, though some members, like Le Pen, were much keener on this than those who joined for purely economic reasons. Their position was sometimes ambiguous, and they voted against special powers for Algeria in the spring of 1956. In Algeria itself, the Poujadists naturally moved closer to the French Algeria elements, and when Guy Mollet, the newly appointed Prime Minister, visited Algiers in February 1956, he was pelted with tomatoes by settlers who feared he might sell them out. This was organised by Gaullists, but the local Poujadists played their part. As for the emerging common market, Poujade was surprisingly cautious, in sharp contrast to UKIP. At a pre-election press conference, when he was asked about the Europe of the Six, as it was then known, he simply replied, "That's a territory that you won't lead me on to." Now, for the French left, Poujadism was a disconcerting and disruptive element which it had to try and understand and relate to. Often it seemed the left was trying to fit Poujadism into its already existing strategy, rather than examining what was new and original in the movement. The attitude of the French Communist Party was complex. Initially, the communists were very friendly towards Poujade. His very first action in Saint-Céré was organised jointly with a blacksmith called Fréjac, who is said to have been a communist. When Poujade held his first big rally in Paris in 1955, the communist daily paper L'Humanité gave it a rave review on its front page and reported 15,000 artisans and tradespeople from all over France stood up, dignified, determined and enthusiastic. Delegates of tens and tens of thousands organised in 67 départements. Yes, they agreed. Yes, they wanted to live. Yes, they intended to continue the struggle in unity against the abuses of excessive taxation and for a truly just taxation system. This fitted the Communist Party view that peasants and petty bourgeois were the natural allies of the working class. The Communist Party may even have hoped to take over the UDCA and make it into a satellite. But in October 1955, shortly before the elections, the Communist Party announced its break with Poujade in a front-page article in L'Humanité by Rocher, who would later be leader of the party. It noted the Communist Party had always supported the demands of tradespeople and artisans against the taxation system, but Rocher noted that Poujade now seemed to have wider political ambitions which conflicted with the CP. Poujade violently attacks all political parties without distinction, without taking any account of the actions of each of them, and above all without making the distinction between the parties of the bourgeoisie, which are responsible for the present situation, and the party of the working class, for which he reserves a good part of his attacks. And he accused Poujade of trying to draw his support into an adventurist enterprise of fascist character. This characterisation of Poujade as a fascist was to be much developed after the election results. And to understand that, I think you have to put it in context. Central to the Communist Party's strategy in the election was the demand for a new Popular Front. It was just 20 years since the election of the Popular Front of 1936, when an alliance of communists, socialists and radicals had won a majority. Ever since, the Communist Party had been thrown out of the government in 1947 at the beginning of the Cold War. All other parties had refused to include them in a governmental combination, which, given that the Communists had the support of nearly a quarter of the electorate, meant establishing a stable majority was even more difficult. The 1956 results would have made possible a government based on the Communists, Socialists and Mondis France wing of the radicals. However, there was no chance that either the Socialists or Mondis France would accept this. The 36th Popular Front had been formed in reaction to Hitler's coming to power in Germany and the rise of fascism in France. So the existence of a fascist threat was actually quite useful to the Communist Party in developing its demand for a new Popular Front. So the Communist Party, the CGT, the trade union it controlled, began a vigorous campaign against Poujade, organising counter-demonstrations. He was called Poujadolf, a Nazi, a fascist, a Hitlerite and a Francoite. On the 5th of March 1956, his opponents prevented him addressing a meeting in Toulouse. Such language had a real resonance in a country that had been under Nazi occupation a little over 10 years earlier. But always the stress was on the need for a Popular Front and the role of the Socialist Party in refusing this. On the 7th of January, Julien Dubrow told readers of L'Humanité that the blame for Poujade's success could be attributed to the Socialist Party failures to make an electoral alliance. He went on, as for the relative success of Poujade, applauded by all the Vichyites and all the anti-Semites in France, it is comparable to the relative success of La Roque at the time of the Popular Front. It is the Popular Front that will dispel it, and not this swamp which claims it can triumph over fascism without the aid of the communists. The swamp Dubrow referred to was something called the Republican Front. The Republican Front was an electoral alliance cobbled up between four parties of the centre-left. The Socialist Party, François Mitterrand's UDSR, Democratic Socialist Union of the Resistance, the left radicals led by Mondis France, and the Social Republicans, formerly the Gaullists. Jacques Fauvet, who was a very astute political commentator, later noted, "The Republican Front was an advertising slogan rather than a political formula. It was launched hastily, without a contract or a programme. The expression was coined by the Friends of Mondays France. Its sole official manifestation was the publication of 2 statements signed by the leaders of the 4 theoretically associated parties. Moreover, these 4 protagonists took good care not to set an example by concluding alliances in their own constituencies. The constituents of the Republican Front also, though less systematically than the Communists, found it useful to denounce Poujade as a fascist. Thus, Le Populaire, paper of the Socialist Party, declared that the vast majority of the French people wanted change. Those who are Republicans and voted for the Democratic left, those who aren't Republicans, those who hitherto have completely lacked interest in public affairs, have awoken to vote against the Republic. And the Poujadists here too were described as fascists. Mondays France, while not calling the Poujadists fascists, found it useful to summon up the Poujadist threat. It would be a grave error to underestimate the danger of the Poujadist rise. Only a policy of reforms, a policy of rebuilding carried out consistently on all levels, in short, the policy of the Republican Front, by restoring confidence in the Republic and hope in the destiny of France, can make the troublemakers unable to do more harm. Or in short, the only hope is Mondays France's Prime Minister. François Mitterrand was rather more cautious. True, in the election period, he denounced Poujadism as a resurrection of backstairs fascism, but he had been provoked by the fact that they were systematically disrupting his meetings. But in a pre-election cabinet meeting, he's reported to have said, if Poujade has thousands of people ready to go to prison, we can't do anything against them. Mitterrand always had a good sense of the balance of forces, and in the aftermath of the election, his comments were cautious. The Poujadist advance shows that when the Gaullist tide receded, it left behind it a certain discontent with the regime. It is certain that, much more than the number of deputies of this new party, the social and political phenomenon it reveals must be studied closely. Mitterrand was an intelligent man who saw that Poujadism was a symptom of a real problem. He was also a shrewd political operator who was keeping his options open for political alliances that might have to be made. One of the main publications promoting the Republican Front was the weekly L'Express, which from October until after the elections became a daily. After the election results were known, L'Express too took up the argument that the Poujadists were fascists. The foreign press, which judges things with more distance than we can, reminds us that Hitler's movement began in the same way. So let's take advantage of the lessons of history. Basing itself on Poujade's rather theatrical promise that disobedient deputies would be hanged, L'Express demanded that the election of the Poujadists be annulled as unconstitutional, because the deputies were subject to threat or whatever. Further article declared that Poujade's new newspaper, Fraternité Française, removed all remaining doubts about the organisation's orientation. The methods of Poujade's technique are tried and tested. They were used in Italy by Mussolini, in Germany by Hitler, among others. They're the classic methods of fascism at its birth: defamation, racism and anti-republicanism. So L'Express found it just as useful as the CP to point to the fascist threat. The only difference was that L'Express, from its centre-left perspective, tended to lump the Poujadists and the CP together as enemies of the Republic. During the election campaign, it was even suggested that the Poujadists and the CP were still in some sort of alliance. It was alleged that the Poujadists did not attack CP election meetings. As L'Humanité pointed out with some justice, this was no mystery. Senility. The other parties could only mobilise small meetings. A CP meeting with hundreds of workers was a less appetising target for the Poujadist thugs. L'Express did carry a more thoughtful piece by the novelist François Mauriac, in which he argued that the Poujadists were the product of social change in modern France. In such popular movements, the visible pretexts always conceal deeper reasons. Here, I am thinking of the contrast between these depopulated provinces and the enormous political Paris which doesn't care about them, which only speaks in the past tense of their small businesses and of rural craftsmen. In Paris, it's never a question of anything except their death. And was Poujade a fascist? Now, certainly there were fascistic elements in the movement: thuggishness, anti-Semitism, anti-parliamentarism, nationalism, and so on. Some individuals in the movement were undoubtedly nostalgic for Vichy. Others, like Jean-Marie Le Pen, looked forward to the real French fascism which would emerge in the 1980s. But Le Pen's alliance with Poujade was short-lived and uneasy. Jim Walters and Peter Fish have shown that there's little continuity between either Poujade's base of support or his politics and those of Le Pen 30 years on. The dangers of using the term fascist indiscriminately were seen in Germany in the early 30s. Its use to describe Poujade, while having far less dangerous consequences, was also inaccurate. In fact, the Poujadists themselves sometimes use the word fascist as a term of abuse, as is shown by a scene from the French Parliament in February 1956. I'll quote this because it really shows the depths to which parliamentary democracy had fallen in France in this period. Le Pen is speaking. "The people opposite us are fascists." The far-right deputies then stand up and sing the Marseillaise. The communists: "Fascists, fascists, Hitlerites." The Poujadists: "Get back to Moscow, Fellahas." Fernand Grenier of the Communist Party: "These are the agents of Doriot sitting on the extreme right, people in the service of the Gestapo." Le Pen: "My father was killed by the Germans, imbecile." Other sections of the left had rather different approaches. Much more sober and intelligent attitude was shown by the weekly France Observateur, edited by Claude Bourdet. It did make comparisons with fascism, but it also published some more sober and reflective articles. How am I doing for time?
Another quarter now.
Okay, do my best for you. Gilles Martinet wrote a report from a village in Brittany during the election campaign. "So here we are at the heart of the problem. These men aren't fascists, but the so-called apolitical demagogy of the Poujade movement has made them terribly susceptible to fascism. In the course of the electoral campaign, they can see that when they speak about taxes, they scarcely interest anyone except tradespeople. But when they use anti-parliamentary slogans, they reach other social layers, small peasants, office workers, etc." He noted the negative aspects of Poujadism and the parallels with the pre-war extreme right. It is, however, impossible not to see here that a good number of these artisans and small tradespeople, whom Poujadism has thrown into political action, are beginning to ask themselves certain questions and are taking an interest in problems which they had neglected until then. Poujade at the moment is playing the sorcerer's apprentice. The left parties, and not only the communists, therefore have an interest in not avoiding contact with his troops, and on the contrary, in initiating discussions which will only rarely give immediate results, but which will not be without importance for the future. Another contributor to France Observateur, Jacques Armel, made an important point when he wrote just after the elections. "The contempt displayed by intellectuals for the mediocrities of the UDCA is now out of date." I think it's certainly possible to find examples of intellectual snobbery on the part of the left, comparable to the way that the public school boys of Private Eye used to mock Grocer Heath, or Harvard-educated Democrats sneered at Sarah Palin's ignorance. It's perhaps unfair to blame Le Canard-Enchaîné for mocking Poujade, since this satirical weekly mocked everybody of every tendency. But the jokes directed at Poujade do reveal a certain intellectual snobbery. There's great glee at the Poujadists' inability to write grammatical French, as in a statement which read, "Against corruption and cowardice, against confusion and treachery, with Poujade, who was set as an example of this." Or again, the paper published a mock Poujade programme full of puns relating to shops, so that Poujade, instead of referring to his movement as jusqu'au boutiste, diehards, called them jusqu'au boutique, up to the shops. Behind the wordplay, it's hard not to discern a certain feeling of superiority to village shopkeepers. Others on the left chose to ignore Poujade completely, considering with some reason that other issues, above all the crisis in Algeria, were far more important. This seems to have been true of the emerging group known as the Nouvelle Gauche. Poujade and his friends had a very low view of intellectuals. They were contemptuous of the graduates of the École Polytechnique, whom they blamed for France's unjust taxation system. Le Pen declared at one election meeting that France is ruled by pederasts, Sartre, Camus, Mauriac. In general, the intellectuals didn't respond in kind. As far as I can see, Sartre never mentioned Poujade. Simone de Beauvoir's autobiography, which gives a fascinating chronicle of French political intellectual life, only makes one reference to Poujade. She notes that by the end of 1956, all resistance to the war in Algeria had ceased. If Poujade had lost all importance, it was because everybody in France had become a Poujadiste. A little unfair, since the Poujadists had voted against special powers in Algeria, while the Communist Party supported them. Sartre's journal Le Temps Moderne also said little about Poujade. I've only managed to find over 18 months one paragraph within one article by Jean Pouillon, who comments, "L'Express is shouting the loudest about Poujade, but to counter him, it's advocating a policy of jumping out of the frying pan into the fire. In reality, if Poujade is a fascist, there's only one way to stop him doing any harm, and to force him into a struggle which would be premature for him, and that's the Popular Front. It's possible that the Communist Party will fail to recognise the danger and is running the risk of committing afresh the errors of the pre-Hitler period. But in this case, what are those who want to avoid this waiting for to take the initiative of an alliance of the whole left on the basis of a struggle against the Poujade movement?" During the election period, the novelist Albert Camus contributed regularly to L'Express in support of the new Mondes France government, in support of what he hoped would be a new Mondes France government. Camus showed no sympathy to the Poujadists. He considered their anti-Semitism was enough to discredit a movement which should be fought as it deserves. He accepted that there were real grievances about the tax system, but insisted that there can be no question of showing even for a second any indulgence for propaganda techniques borrowed from fascism. He was generally pessimistic about the political scene, but for Camus, the communists were at least as bad as the Poujadists, and he wound up by saying that as long as they did not abandon considering totalitarianism as a possible means of government, no socialist and no free man could accept any compromise with them. The one intellectual who attempted a serious analysis of Poujadism was Rollonback, who wrote 2 articles in Les Lettres Nouvelles, which were later collected in the volume Mythologie. Barthes noted Poujade's hostility to intellectuals who are discredited by their very position outside the computable reality, and his invocation of common sense, whose role is to posit equivalencies between what can be seen and what is, and to ensure a world without transfer, without transition, and without progression. Examining Poujade's hatred of intellectuals, he notes that for Poujade, what intellectuals do cannot be defined as work, and therefore the intellectual is by definition an idler. And he shows that Poujade's arguments can be reduced to tautologies. All anti-intellectualism ends up in the death of language, that is, the destruction of sociability. Now, some of his points, I think, are very well made, but there does seem to be a possibility that Barthes' response to the blunt, simplified language of Poujade led on to the encouragement of the contorted and often incomprehensible language used by the later Barthes and his postmodernist followers. What almost all the commentators failed to reckon on was the extreme fragility of the Poujade movement. It rose like a rocket and fell like a stick. Its parliamentary group was soon depleted, several members being disqualified for breach of the incomprehensible electoral regulations. Le Pen, the group's most effective orator, was increasingly in conflict with Poujade, and by October 1956 he'd taken leave from the National Assembly to go and join a parachute regiment in Algeria. The debacle came in October 1956 with the Suez events. I'll describe in full the report of Le Monde's correspondent. In the Poujadist group, things seemed simple. Spontaneously, several of its members had applauded Monsieur Guy Mollet, who of course had just initiated the invasion of Egypt. It seemed obvious that for once they were going to approve the cabinet's action, which was at last of a decisive nature. But suddenly, Monsieur Poujade intervened by telephone in the debate, communicating his orders to the group. He had, he said, thought a great deal, and his meditation had led him to refuse to fight for the Queen of England. There was consternation. The average Poujadist didn't understand what was going on and was unhappy to obey. Only the habit of discipline meant that a small majority, 28 out of 42, once more agreed to accept the decision. Effectively, it was the end of the road. Nobody was hanged, but one deputy was expelled and 3 agreed to resign from the National Assembly. Poujade personally, abandoning his earlier pledge not to stand for Parliament, stood in a by-election in January 1957, got a poor result. 1958, the corrupt and inefficient Fourth Republic collapsed under the strains of the Algerian War. Charles de Gaulle emerged from retirement to establish the Fifth Republic. De Gaulle's support owed something to the distrust of the traditional political parties, which had given Poujadism its moment of glory. But he was also, unlike Poujade, a resolute moderniser. For example, it was de Gaulle's rapid expansion of higher education that led to the events of 1968. The Poujadists campaigned in favour of de Gaulle in the referendum, establishing the Fifth Republic, but got only around 400,000 votes in the subsequent parliamentary elections. Effectively, Poujadism disappeared. The most noxious bit of its legacy, Jean-Marie Le Pen, remained as a deputy for another party. One of the most interesting accounts of Poujadism is given by Christine Ross in her book Fast Cars, Clean Bodies. For her, Poujadism was essentially a reaction against modernisation, notably the tendency to mass production and distribution, favoured by Poujade's arch-enemy, Mendès France. French society for the Poujadists was equally menaced by American industrialisation and Soviet collectivisation, both of which would standardise away the unique quality of French life. Tomorrow, we will all have the same shirt, the same suit, the same pair of shoes. We will buy all these things from the same automatic distributor. They want to turn us into a bunch of robots. Poujade's was but an extreme expression of a popular fear common to those who sought shelter behind the watchword of quality, a characteristic held to define both French products and the French way of life, the latter embodied by those 3 stalwart individuals, the peasant, the artist, and the individual entrepreneur. Ross also pointed to the paradox that while opposing modernisation, Poujade's whole campaign was dependent on the technological development which was central to French modernisation in the 1950s, the motor car, without which his punishing schedule of meetings simply couldn't have happened. In fact, Poujade had a loudspeaker van, very much a novelty at the time, with its own electrical generator. Ross also pointed out the central role of the traditional family in Poujade's view of the world. The Poujadist couple, installed behind their shop counter, constitute a strict domestic and professional association. The daily life of the family and the business are united within the boutique. During Poujadist rallies, the wife minds the store. A menace to the couple would affect the commercial equilibrium and prosperity as well. I think it's worth noting the direct continuity there with Jacobinism. The reason the Jacobins closed down the women's clubs was because the small artisans who made up Jacobinism's support needed their wives at home. Poujadism also reflected a very deep distrust of parliamentary institutions. Again, 1 or 2 results from EFOP. In the autumn of 1955, those sampled were asked if, in the forthcoming elections, voters would influence the politics of the country. Only 14% thought they would have a large influence, 33% thought they would have no influence, and another 27% didn't know. Asked before the elections which political group was most likely to achieve the things they wanted, only 1% named the Poujade grouping, but 38% didn't know. We may imagine a good many of those voted for Poujade. And when asked a week before the election who they hoped to see as Prime Minister, 27% named Mendès France. No one else achieved double figures, and just 2% named Poujade. Again, with 30% don't knows. Only 2% named Guy Mollet, leader of the Socialist Party, but it was he, not Mendès France, who eventually became Prime Minister as a result of parliamentary manoeuvring. The political theorist Maurice Duverger wrote about this. Our democracy is dying because the people has been exiled from it. Once its representatives have been elected, these engage in esoteric games from which the citizens are excluded. Poujadism would not have achieved its present size if it hadn't in some way expressed this frustration of citizens deprived of any real influence on their choice of leaders. Who would claim that the voters of 2nd of January wanted to see Monsieur Molly at the head of the government? A few years later, the sociologist Pierre Fouché-Rolas examined Poujade's support in terms of his apoliticism. Finally, if anti-parliamentarism is accompanied with tendencies favourable to a dictatorial regime, about 2 more minutes. For example, among the ultranationalists of the far right, and to a lesser extent among the sympathisers of the Poujade movement, it's not the case with the anti-parliamentary consensus of which we've noted the signs. The latter, no more today than yesterday, does not seem to us in France to be an aspect of a fascist-type mentality. I think Poujade was clearly right to see there was no immediate fascist threat, but perhaps wrong not to see a long-term trend to depoliticisation. Parliamentary democracy has survived in France as elsewhere, but with ever greater levels of cynicism and non-participation. Yet as Poujade showed, the politics of anti-politics faces enormous contradictions. As a contemporary commentator noted, the possibility for the Poujade movement to return to purely economic activity is already ruled out. The destiny of Poujadism is political, and it is in this framework that we must estimate the forms which it can take. Anti-political attitudes are all around us, but whether they can take on a political form is highly questionable. Poujadism was a symptom, not the problem itself, and certainly not the solution.